Hello, changemakers. Bonjour tout le monde. Tanchi, kia? I'm Mike Perry, and I'm honored to be the Executive Director of the Institute for Change Leaders. And welcome to this new Voices of Change podcast. The ICL equips people from all walks of life with the public narrative storytelling and concrete organizing skills they need to lead transformative, lasting, and progressive change in their communities that they and their communities want to see. We base our leadership programs on the work of renowned organizer Marshall Gans. Look around us. Times are tough. Where's the hope? Well, the hope is in all of us and in this new podcast for action. So won't you join us? And now, over to your Changemaker host.
Hello world, everyone listening and those who may have clicked on this by accident. Welcome. You may notice that this is a different voice than the one you're used to. My name is Mathis Cleuziou, and I will be taking over from the incredible Alex as your host of ICL's podcast, Voices of Change, where we talk to those making change, one voice at a time across Canada and beyond. For episode 4 of this podcast, we are very lucky to be joined by an incredible journalist at the forefront of covering Canada's changemakers and calling out those who are stifling their efforts or trying to stifle their efforts. You've been the editor of Rabble.ca since 2022. Prior to that, you were the editor of the Cornwall Seaway News, covering the happenings of the city of Cornwall, the United Counties of SD&G, and the Indigenous people of Akwesasne. Akwesasne, I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
On top of this already incredible resume, you're also an OCNA or OCNA award-winning journalist. Thank you for making it out to Toronto so early. In the morning, we just talked about how early you had to leave the house this morning, and we really appreciate you making the time, and we're incredibly excited you're here. So how are you?
Thank you very much. Like you mentioned in your intro, I'm Nick Seebruch. I'm the editor of Rabble.ca. Very happy to be here talking about something I'm very passionate about, journalism, progressive journalism, promoting change. And thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you very much. Do you have time to say hi to your dogs, Bowie and Freddie, this morning before you left?
No, Bowie and Freddie were still asleep at 6 a.m. this morning.
Fair enough. So was I. So we've just covered your impressive resume, but how did you get into journalism? What was the moment that you decided that this was your calling?
Well, I've always been interested in news and politics. Going back to when I was very, very young, there was always news on in our house. We watched it over dinner. I studied history at university and wasn't really sure what I wanted to do after I got my history degree. But then I was like, I'm so passionate about the news, maybe I should just get into it and do that. So I went to Concordia University and got a graduate diploma through their graduate diploma in journalism program. It's a very practical, very intensive 1-year course, but you get a lot of experience, a lot of hands-on work in things like this, like radio and podcasting. So that's how I got my start.
Awesome. Very nice. I can definitely relate to watching the news over dinner. That was a staple in my household as well. Now, naturally, working in organizing like I do, we're very reliant on the news, especially reliable news, which I will ask you about in just a second. The reliability of news and how to make sure that what we're reading is in fact true. Mm-hmm. But we rarely ever get to see behind the scenes. What is it really like in the newsroom? Are the editors running around, deadlines to make?
Well, it changes from newsroom to newsroom, and journalism as an industry is in such been in such a great upheaval and state of change for I'd say like 20 years now, really, since Web 2.0 and the internet really took off. So I've worked in newsrooms where you have a team, your whole team is together in one room, you're bouncing story ideas off of one another, you're meeting on a daily basis. In person. Where I work now at Rabble, we're all remote. We're all spread out across the country. We have a virtual office. We communicate over Slack, over email, over Zoom for a weekly story meeting. And just to get an idea of what that's like and kind of how the sausage is made, once a week I'll convene my team for a weekly story meeting. We meet on Tuesdays at 1 o'clock. We discuss what's in the news this week, where we want to put our focus, who's going to write it, who we're going to be talking to, and that kind of grounds us and sets ourselves up, hopefully, for success for the week.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting as well, talking about how being able to be remote allows for that coverage. How do you think that's changed the coverage that Rabble has compared to other places where it's maybe more centralized in one newsroom?
Yeah, good question. I think maybe we're a little bit more reliant on the expertise of our writers who are closer to the stories, just in terms of geography and knowledge. We're reliant a little bit more on them to be experts on things, especially in terms of what they're covering. So, being distant, though, it hasn't really changed how close-knit we are as a team. We're a very small team, and we rely on each other very much. But, instead of asking, the person sitting next to us, hey, what are you working on? What do you need help with? Or asking them a question about a story that we're working on, often we have to go and find that information ourselves. And then, if we have a lot of trouble, we'll reach out to one another and lean on to dip into the knowledge of one another.
Awesome. That's actually super interesting, also seeing how it's changed. And then speaking of change, especially in the last 10 years to me, it seems as though the amount of reliable sources has diminished greatly, or at least they're harder to find amongst all this noise. I think there's also been a drop-off in the amount of people trusting the news. That's something that we've been able to track quite well. How do you make sure that the news that you're reading for your stories, as well as personally, and that you're reporting on, and your journalists are reporting on, and so this is the news that the community then uses as a catalyst for change? How do you make sure that that is reliable? How do you make sure that that is the truth?
Well, of course, going back to the dawn of the newspaper industry and the news industry, as good journalists do their due diligence. They make sure that their sources, what they say, can be backed up by the facts. They do their own research, and I always tell. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later about the journalists who I mentor, because we have a mentorship program at Rabble in partnership with Institute for Change Leaders. I always tell them, lean on subject matter experts. Get more than one source in your story so that you have a variety of perspectives and opinions. But then you get a little bit into that balance question of, should I only rely on one opinion? Well, if one person is saying that the sky is blue and the other one's saying the sky is green, maybe don't include that other opinion if you can go outside and look and tell people what the color of the sky is.
I come from a climate organizing space, and I think that's something that we often deal with as well, especially around man-made or human-made climate change.
A lot of disinformation to sift through in that topic.
Oh yeah, even in academia. With the advent of the internet, like you said, Web 2.0 with social media, it seems as though there's so much news from so many sources. There's a lot of noise out there. How has this impacted your work? Do you think it's harder to stand out amongst all of this noise, or being a small independent news company, does that play to your strengths as well? And is this, without trying to heap too many questions on you, is this democratization of news a positive, or is it a bit of a challenge as well?
Well, big question, so I'll try to deconstruct it as best as I can. But to answer the first part, I'll use a couple of metaphors. One, the internet is like a fire hose. And at Rabble, like with many news outlets, we're trying to serve people a glass of water. Okay. If you're trying to fill a fire hose with a glass of water, it's a bit of a trick to do as a writer, to take all of that information that you can have access to and distill it down to something consumable by a reader. And then, talking about competition with everything coming out of that fire hose, it used to be, if you asked a journalist 30 years ago who their main competition is, say they worked here at the Toronto Star or at the National Post, or where I was at the Cornwall Seaway News, you'd say, well, what's your competition? Well, my competition in Cornwall is the Cornwall Standard Freeholder. It's the other news outlets. Your competition right now as a news outlet or any content creator on the internet is everything. You're fighting for eyeballs and attention against everything. So again, trying to sift through the deluge of information that comes out of that fire hose to distill it into a nice consumable glass of water, but also, to maybe flavor that glass of water a little bit so it stands out from every other glass of water that's on the counter that people are being served.
Yeah, and so I really like that metaphor, that image. Do you think that's with the internet, where you said that there's now so many more eyeballs and so many more people paying attention? How do you feel people are getting their news nowadays compared to, when it was just the two news outlets? They might both be biased, right? That's something that we talk about a lot, and that we notice a lot in our society. Do you think that now with the democratization of news, it is easier to find a reliable cup of water? Or do you think that there's so many false cups of water out there, to use your own metaphor a little bit?
Yeah, well, it used to be when there were less sources and less access to information prior to the internet, that most people were getting their news from the same source every day. Either it was Walter Cronkite at night here in Canada, it would be Peter Mansbridge, but nowadays, you have so many options to get your news from, and it's hard to find which is reliable. So in terms of where people are getting their news now, we do have some metrics on that. Back in the day, people would cite their subscription rate or their Nielsen rating on TV or on the radio. Now we know we have Google Analytics. We can say a lot of our traffic is coming from social media. Well, it used to. Bill C-18 2 years ago changed that very much. Now we're finding a lot of people, in terms of survey responses, are finding the internet through things like TikTok, places like that. So, in terms of advice I could give people on how to make sure they're consuming reliable news, it's now so much more dependent, and there's so much more onus on the consumer rather than even on the journalist, because there's just so many people putting out information that now it's really on the consumer to separate the wheat from the chaff rather than it is the journalist. I'd say the best way to do that is to consume a wide variety. Go to, think of the media landscape like a buffet. Take a little bit of everything, find out what you like, and find out what's consistent, what's consistently correct, and what's consistently debunked. There's also news on news, media analysts who analyze news that comes out of places like Fox or non-traditional news sources. I'm thinking there's a lot of people, unfortunately, who get their news from Joe Rogan. Maybe look at what some media analysts and what some media experts are saying about your sources, and weed out the ones that maybe aren't serving you that well.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. Definitely some advice that I'm going to take home as well. And I think, just going back to that bill, I think for our listeners and our viewers, if you've been on social media in the past few years, as I've been, as most young people especially have been, here in Canada, the news outlets have been hidden due to this bill that you mentioned. How do you view this bill? And how does it change your work? And last question on that, what has it done for the people trying to make change in their communities if you can't access the news through social media, where admittedly a lot of organizing and a lot of idea sharing does happen?
Right, so we're talking about Bill C-18, and there's quite a story for this. I'm going to go a little bit into the story overall, because it's so important. Like journalists, this was hugely changing, like one of the biggest changes since the advent of the internet for Canadian journalists. And I have a personal story of how it changed my work personally, both here at Rabble and at my previous job at my local weekly paper of Cornwall Seaway News. So Bill C-18 was the Trudeau government's attempt to get organizations who profit off of news traffic to their platforms to pay to support news outlets who create that content. Of course, news, the industry's been shrinking, we've been hemorrhaging jobs, outlets have been closing, because it's been really difficult since the advent of the internet to find a consistently viable funding model. Bill C-18 was supposed to fix that by getting companies, namely Google and Facebook, to pay media companies for the content that they create that drives traffic to their website. And we were driving traffic to their website. And this is where I'll get into my personal story. When I was at Seaway News, I redesigned our strategy to reach readers to be centered around Facebook. We got around 400,000 views on our content a month for a population of around 45,000. That's a significant amount of impressions. 60% of those views came from Facebook. I left before BLC 18 came in, which is but Seaway News, now is struggling because so much traffic was based around Facebook. And a lot of outlets experienced the same thing. Rabble wasn't quite as Facebook-based. We relied a little bit more on newsletters and direct traffic. But much like the advent of the internet, this has really had to change the way that we engage with our readers and the way we drive traffic to our content. Because while Google has agreed to pay and comply with Bill C-18 to a degree, much less than the government had hoped, and to far fewer outlets than the government had wanted, Facebook and Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, has chosen not to. So you cannot view news content on Facebook or Meta. This has made it a lot more difficult because so many people, especially in smaller rural communities, were getting their news from Facebook. It's hindered access to information. It's hindered the ability to organize, because often people would organize around a news article. They would share something I would write on Cornwall Seaway News, and they would put it up on their Facebook page and say, everyone take a look at this. And it says in this article, this event is happening on this day. We should all be there, share it with your friends. Now you can't do that. So you're having to very much change. We were just getting used to the age of Facebook, and then Bill C-18 kind of upended everything.
Yeah. No, I noticed that in my personal work as well, and I think it's very interesting hearing from an editor as yourself how that's impacted your life from the other side. Now, for those of our listeners that don't know, so thank you very much for shedding some light on that. For those of our listeners that don't know, Rabble.ca is an independent media outlet. Nick, do you mind giving us a little bit more information on what that means? What is an independent media outlet? What are the pros and cons of being an independent media outlet? Yeah.
Right. So independent media outlet means that we're not beholden to any sort of corporate or advertiser interests. You watch your news on CTV, and I think people saw this maybe a couple of years ago with the Lisa LaFlamme controversy at CTV, where the corporate entity that owns CTV had a different editorial vision than journalists who were working for them at their subsidiary. Rabble doesn't have to worry about that. We don't have a parent company. We're supported by advertisers and underwriters. A lot of our underwriters include labor unions. We're very passionate about reporting on news in the labor space, and while we do receive support from labor unions, we're in no way, I wouldn't say beholden to them, but we're in no way expected to be writing favorable news about our underwriters. We cover their news in an unbiased and professional way, and we feel that that is the value that we bring not only to our underwriters, but our readers as a whole, and to the news space as a whole, as any journalist should view their job, whether they're supported by advertising or by donations. You should tell your supporters that the value you bring to them is that you have integrity as a journalist, that you are unbiased, and that you will share the facts in an unblemished way. That whether you're sharing news that they might not agree with, at least that they're trusting that you're being fair about it. And that's the value of a news outlet, is to provide that confidence, that certainty, that trust in your reporting, whether it's about someone who supports your organization financially or doesn't. They should know that you're going to treat them fairly and the same as you would any other subject.
Thank you. Yes, I couldn't agree more on that point as well. I think that's a very good way of putting it, especially around disagreements and just that you trust that they're coming from a place where they've looked at the facts, and even if you disagree with the conclusions that they draw, there's a factual basis that you can agree on. So I can imagine that there's a lot of listeners of this podcast here today that are keen to get into journalism, especially I think independent journalism such as Rabble.ca. How would you recommend someone get started? How does a young person best enter the field of journalism?
Well, the field of journalism today, it's a struggling industry. It's a challenge. You get into it because you have a passion for it and you believe in the mission. It's a very mission-driven field of work. You're not getting into journalism usually for the money or the hours or the travel. So you're getting into it because you feel that this is important and it's a calling. I would say, and in this day and age, so many people can be journalists. I interviewed someone for an employment interview a few weeks ago, and they had a little bit of journalism experience, but not too much. And they said, I don't want to call myself a journalist yet. I'm like, if you're doing the work, you can call yourself a journalist. And in this day and age, you have a phone, you can record interviews, you have a computer, you can write things up. So you have the tools to start. I would say if anyone's interested, consume a lot of news, like we mentioned earlier in the conversation, from a lot of different sources. There are journalists who I've watched who really informed how I construct my stories and present myself and present the news. And it's very helpful to learn from the masters. So I'd say start there, write a lot, send pitches everywhere. Someone bites, then you have your start.
Awesome. And just going back to that point right before we wrap up here, what are some of the journalists, what are some of the news that you recommend people, other than Rabble.ca, that you recommend people include in their daily media diet?
Yeah, well, they all have their strengths and their flaws, like we all do as individuals. CBC gets a lot of flack, but they also do produce a lot of good work, especially their Fifth Estate team. I'd say W5, same goes for them over at CTV. On a news level, like a print online news level, I'd say that the Narwhal, the National Observer, both do really good work. The Tyee, our colleagues over there, and yes, of course, Rabble.ca.
So the last two questions. Moving on to your story with ICL, we are here at the Voices of Change podcast by ICL. There is a latent scholarship with Rabble.ca. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is, why it's important, and what we are trying to do with it?
So this is the Jack Layton Journalism Fellowship for Change. We've ran this program in partnership with ICL for a few years now. And what it is it's a paid opportunity for a young, aspiring journalist to have some one-on-one mentorship with me at Rabble. You join our remote workspace. Also, a big part of this is we ask our applicants to submit a long-form journalism pitch where they can do a deep dive into a story of social importance in Canada and really do a very in-depth investigative piece. Day to day, I'll also be assigning a lot of shorter news pieces to our fellow who will gain some experience in covering things like unions, Indigenous issues, feminist issues, environmental issues. So very much what I enjoy about it is it gives me an opportunity to meet and help mentor the next generation of journalists, while also through the financial support we give, both in partnership with ICL, create some paid journalism work for stories that I wouldn't have time or be able to cover otherwise. So really a win-win all around.
Perfect, and I can only encourage people to check that out. I think the deadline's just passed, but I'm assuming there'll be another one.
We're very soon. We're going to be announcing this year's Jack Layton for Change Fellow. But look on our website in September of 2025, and you'll see the application open for our 2025-2026 Jack Layton Journalism for Change Fellow.
Perfect, and I think that also allows us to plug our mailing list a little bit. We will send out an email about that as well when those nominations and self-nominations do come up. I do have one final question.
Yep.
And this is a question we ask all of our guests. What is the key trait someone must have in order to create change?
Believe that it's possible. The change, what we cover at Rabble, the issues that you guys deal with here at Institute for Change Leaders, they seem like very big, insurmountable problems, and people can feel like they're just one person. One, remember that if you feel like this is an issue that you're passionate about, that something needs to be done, you're probably not the only one. And in this day and age, you can find other people you can connect with. And also, just believe that it can be done, that you can make that change that you want to see. It's true, just go out there and get involved and volunteer, even if you only have an hour a week of your time to give. That's an hour more that takes everyone a step closer to a better future.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's incredibly well put. Thank you very much. This has been Voices of Change, where we talk to those making change one voice at a time in Canada and beyond. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a very safe trip back home, and thank you very much for waking up this early for this. I know you've had quite a ride, and hopefully you'll be able to say hi to your dogs when you make it home.
Oh, I'm sure I will. Thank you so much for having me.
Perfect.